So, I'm going to discuss paraphilic disorders, clinical descriptions. So, paraphilic disorders ay disorders sa sexual arousal na nagkukos ng distress or impairment sa individual or personal harm and harm to others. Yung mga taong may sexual dysfunction ay hindi lang nakaka-experience ng isang dysfunction. In reality, nakaka-experience sila ng 2 to 3 or more paraphilic disorders, pero merong isang dominant. So, there are different kinds of paraphilic disorders, and the first one is voyeuristic disorder. It is the act of touching or rubbing against a non-consenting person to attain sexual gratification. So, dito naman, yung person is, nirarab niya yung sarili niya hanggang siya ay mag-ejaculate sa isang person na walang consent. So, example of this is sa train. Dahil siksikan sa train, there are cases wherein men will rub themselves against women and walang nagagawa yung women. Kaya usually, in these cases, nagsasucceed yung mga gumagawa nito. Ang criteria for voyeuristic disorder is at least 6 months ng recurrent and intense sexual pleasure from touching or rubbing against an unconsenting person. And the second one is they have acted upon these urges and nagkukos na rin yun ng distress and impairment sa kanilang functioning. So next is fetishistic disorder, wherein a person is sexually attracted to non-living objects. So arousal dito is associated with first, an inanimate object. Second, ang source nila ng arousal is a specific tactile stimulation. For example, is sa rubber, na pag nirarab nila yung sarili nila sa rubber o nararamdaman nila yung friction from rubber, is nagkakaroon sila ng arousal. And third is a source of attraction is part ng body nila. Like for example, sa foot, sa buttocks, or sa hair. So, one example of this is yung napanood ko sa TLC. Yung lalaki is sexually attracted just sa balloon and lagi niyang kasama yung balloon kahit siya magpunta. And he would even do lewd stuffs with the balloon and yun nga parang kinukonsider niya na as his partner yung balloon. The criteria for fetishistic disorder is first, at least 6 months mayroong recurrent and intense sexual arousal from the use of non-living objects. Second is it causes distress or impairment sa functioning. And third is gumagamit na ng mga objects na hindi naman designed for sexual stimulation. Next is voyeuristic disorder, wherein a person is aroused by observing an unsuspecting person na nagbibihis or naked. For example, is yung mga taong palihim na nanonood ng mga babaeng nagbibihis sa tapat ng kanilang bintana. So, criteria for voyeuristic disorder is at least 6 months of recurrent and intense sexual arousal from observing an unsuspecting person who is naked. Second is they have acted upon these sexual urges and nagkukos na rin yun ng distress or impairment sa kanilang functioning. And the third one is they are at least 18 years old. So next is exhibitionistic disorder. This disorder is the sexual arousal and gratification by exposing genitals to unsuspecting strangers. So an example of this is the case of this man. Yung lalaki na to is he would wait for an attractive girl sa train na matitipuan niya and he will expose his genitals pag malapit na yung stop and then kakaripas siya ng takbo. So, ang criteria for exhibitionistic disorder is at least 6 months ng recurrent and intense sexual arousal from exposing genitals to strangers. And second one is they had acted upon these sexual urges and nagkakos na rin yun ng distress or impairment sa kanilang functioning. Next is transvestic disorder. It involves sexual arousal with the act or fantasies of cross-dressing. So, dito, naa-arouse yung may disorder na to pag sila ay nananamit or iniisip nila na nananamit sila ng opposite sex. So, yung mga nagde-dress in female clothes, kinocompensate nila yung ginagawa nila by associating themselves sa mga macho organization like military. And what's interesting is that karamihan sa mga may disorder na to is married men and yung mga asawa nila is usually supportive sa kanilang behavior na to. And sa transvestic disorder naman, hindi lang pananamit ng pambabae ang nakakapag-arouse sa kanila, kundi pati yung isipan na sila isang babae which involves yung iniisip nila na pinagluluto nila yung male partner nila while naka-apron. So, this is a specifier sa transvestism called autogynephilia. Criteria for transvestic disorder is at least 6 months of recurrent and intense sexual arousal from cross-dressing. And second is, they have acted upon the sexual urges and nagkakos na yon ng distress or impairment sa kanilang functioning. Next is sexual sadism. It is associated with sexual arousal from inflicting pain or humiliation to others. So, an example of this is the case of Jeffrey Dahmer, wherein he would gain sexual gratification from the acts of sadism and cannibalism. Criteria for sexual sadism is at least 6 months of recurrent and intense sexual arousal from the suffering of another person. And second one is they have acted upon these urges and it has caused distress or impairment sa kanilang functioning. Next is sexual masochism. It is the sexual arousal from suffering, pain, or humiliation. The criteria for sexual masochism is at least 6 months of recurrent and intense sexual arousal from the act of being humiliated, beaten, bound, or made to suffer. And second one is it has caused distress or impairment sa kanilang functioning. Next is pedophilic disorder and incest. Pedophilia is being sexually attracted to children and young adolescents who are generally aged 13 years or younger. On the other hand, incest is when the object of pedophiles is their relatives. So, sa pedophilic disorder, the victims tend to be young children, while yung victims ng incest is mga babaeng nag-enter na sa puberty. Criteria for pedophilic disorder is at least 6 months of recurrent and intense sexual arousal from the fantasies of sexual activity with a child. And the second one is that they had acted upon these urges and nagkakos na rin yun ng distress and impairment sa kanilang functioning. And the third one is that they are at least age 16 years and they are 5 years older than the child. So next, we are going to discuss the causes of paraphilic disorders. The first one is undesired kinds of arousal with consensual adults. So, pagka hindi na-meet yung level of arousal na talagang gusto mo kapag kasama mo yung taong nag-agree sa'yo to do sexual stuffs, is that you turn to deviant pattern of sexual arousal para ma-meet yung kung ano talaga yung gusto mong level of arousal. Second is inability to develop adequate sexual relations with the appropriate people. So, kapag hindi mo na fulfill yung appropriate connection sa mga taong dapat mong kasama sa sexual aspects, is nagre-result yun sa paghahanap mo ng iba't ibang way para malabas mo yung sexual feelings mo. And third one is disordered relationships during childhood and adolescence. Pag may messed up relationships yung mga bata and teens, like they experience abuse or hindi nakaka-receive ng right emotional support nung sila'y bata, pwede nun maapektuhan yung understanding nila sa sex and relationships. And yung confusion na yon can lead them to engage in unusual or harmful sexual behaviors when they grow up. Next cause of paraphilic disorders is being abused as children. So, yung experiences nila with abuse can affect their sense of boundaries and self-worth, which makes them more vulnerable to further abuse. Yung trauma rin can impact yung tingin nila sa relationships and intimacy. So, mas nagre-risk yun sa kanila as targets for abuse by others. Next is neutral objects that are repeatedly presented while sexually aroused. For example is yung boots. If laging nakikita ng individual yung boots while he or she is sexually aroused, yung brain nila will start connecting the object with arousal. Kaya kahit makita lang nila yung boots is na-arouse na sila. This is also called classical conditioning. The last cause is sexual fantasies that are repeatedly reinforced by masturbation. So, yung sexual pleasure kasi na nafe-feel sa pagmamasturbate is nag-i-strengthen sa connection ng fantasies ng tao and sa arousal. As time goes by, naka-engrave na sa tao na yung fantasies na yun ay nagdudulot ng sexual pleasure and arousal. And the next presenter is Ms. Rachel, who is going to discuss the assessing and treating paraphilic disorders.